Hi everybody. Historically, to get a job in the tech industry, you needed a computer science degree. Now, computer science is not considered to be an easy major. It is often multiple years of intense training across a variety of technical and mathematical topics. Now, what has made getting a computer science education more complicated, just like we've seen in so many other parts of the industry, is the rise of AI assistants. As a student, how do you learn critical thinking and problem solving when you're just a few keystrokes away from talking to an AI assistant who will not only answer the question for you, but also give you a very detailed rundown of why things work the way they do? It's going to be pretty good. And so, taking a step back and looking even broader, is there even value in the future for a computer science education when, like many people predict, an AI assistant can increasingly be more capable at building very complex systems with very little technical know-how needed by the human in the loop? To dive into all of this, I'm joined by Elisa Cundiff, a faculty instructor in computer science at Colorado State University, and she was recently honored by the National Science Foundation at the White House as one of the 100 superstar instructors in computer science in the US. Basically, there's no one better to talk about this topic and a whole lot of other topics than her. So it's going to be a fun conversation. So let's get started. Elisa, great to meet you. Before I continue on, do you want to please introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me. My name is Elisa Cundiff, and I am an instructor of computer science at Colorado State University here in beautiful Fort Collins. And I'm happy to chat all things computer science education with you because I know you care about this field.
Yes, very much so. And the question I like to always start off with, which I ask all of my guests, is how did you get started in tech? What got you into this field?
I think that's a fun question because it's surprising in CS how divergent some of those paths are, especially I think in our generation where it's a little bit more streamlined now. But in middle school, joined a group called Technology Student Association. It was a vocational student organization where we got to, play with websites and stuff and HTML. And this was in the 90s, so it was still kind of like a gunky experience. Um, and then I actually went into playwriting for my undergraduate degree, but then joined a tech startup company right out of college. And that's where I got really pulled back in because a lot had happened in that time, and it was just so, I think, shocking kind of in the early aughts to see how impactful knowing some programming was, how you could just build out anything that would go across the world. So, yeah, I got pulled back in and lived the crazy startup life for a hot minute.
And then you shifted into teaching.
Yeah, I think that the reason I shifted into teaching is a reason a lot of people shift into teaching. It's that realization of what you wish you had. So after I was at the startup, I was like, man, why didn't we have computer science in my high school? Like, I wish I had learned this stuff instead of just HTML. So I actually went back to my hometown, Las Cruces, and taught computer science, AP computer science in high school in my hometown, and then eventually transferred to teaching at the college level here. But yeah, I think sometimes that drives a lot of people in education. It's like, man, I want, I want, I want other folks to have this.
Which is funny because for me, if I wasn't doing exactly what I'm doing right now, I want to go back into teaching as well. Not go back into teaching. I want to enter the teaching, profession as well. Similar reasons, I'm like, I think there's a better way that I can help explain some of these things from seeing what I saw in the real world that
Yeah.
students could absolutely benefit from.
I think that really sort of bleeds out of your personality, right? Because you're working at Google doing product management stuff, and then well, I get paid to teach. You're just like do it in all your spare time for fun. So I can imagine that that is something you would enjoy doing full time.
Yeah, I do enjoy it, but there is also a different motive as well for me because I work on building things for
Ugh,
developers and people
yeah.
who are doing some of this. And I always, eventually realized that the best way to learn something is to teach it back. And we've seen so many studies that talk about like if you can teach something to people in a more simple way, take complicated topics, distill them down into things that are understandable, it means you really understand the thing. You understand like what matters, what doesn't matter, and what could matter on day 5 or day 10 as opposed to just giving the kitchen sink on day 1. And so for me it helps me stay relevant because as part of my day job I don't write code. I don't
Mm.
actually have to do any of this thing to explore what's going on, but it's hard to build products if you can't resonate with the people you're building it for. And so for me, because I built for developers, my team builds for developers, I do that. But yes, so the motivations for why I'm doing it has definitely changed in the last like almost I guess 20, 25 years since I've been doing this. But my interest is still there though. I do enjoy the art of like taking complicated things and simplifying it, which pays dividends in various other forms of my career and life as well.
It's such a twofer. You're like, sounds like you started out doing it for fun and then you realized some of the side benefits, which allowed you to just justify continuing to do it. And it rings so true. A lot of my undergraduate teaching assistants will say they like, they finally understand the concept when they have to teach it, right? So I had a student who was like, I got through recursion, but when I had to teach it, I actually understood it. And yeah, it's one of the best ways to learn.
Yeah, but when I was doing my undergrad, one of the classes that got my probably my lowest scores in was algorithms. Like I just could never get it and do it well. And so
Yeah,
about two
well,
years ago, I realized like, you know what? Let me write a book on algorithms. Like this would be a
oh,
forcing function
cool.
for me to, relearn things. And also like, I have a daughter. So like if she ever wants to learn this, I'd rather she learn it from me. And
Yeah.
so, I was like kind of aiming it at like, what she might want to read in the future when she's old enough to do this. And now I'm looking back and going like, why did I struggle so much in like, in undergrad when it wasn't that complicated? Like, then it gets back into like, was the teaching off? Was the way it was presented different? Or, the professors were fantastic. They were like
Mm,
extremely talented, world class. Like, I can't blame any of that. It was me, like what in me had changed
mm.
that caused it to not resonate then, but resonate now. And
What do
those
you
are the
think
kind
it
of questions that
was?
always get me to teaching.
Like for algorithms, what changed, do you think, for you? Is it having seen the relevancy in industry and so the kind of like classical why had been answered for you, or motivations changed, or patience? Like, what do you think?
I do not know. As a product manager, I never actually have to write code. So I
Yeah,
never actually directly benefit from knowing this as part of my day job.
yeah.
But I think there's a certain level where I recognize that the way I like to learn more is, of course, understanding like, why is it important? Like, what is the core concept of what you need to do? Because the classic book is a CLRS book, the Corman, Lyserson, Rivest, Steiner, I think at the time, the who wrote the classic algorithms book, and I still
Yeah,
have
yeah,
a copy
yeah.
of it here. And that book really just goes into the details very quickly. It doesn't explain like why, what makes a linked list like, more effective than all these other things, or why do you sort, in this approach as opposed to another
I
approach.
see.
And so I think for me, when I took some time to kind of understand like the subtle details of like why these things are done the way they are and what makes it interesting, and also more importantly, like who are the people behind it that came up with this, like, 30, 40 years ago, and what motivated them. Like, for example, the reason why some of these like fixed memory items are interesting is they were built in a time when there were tape drives and you couldn't just like add more memory. You had like basically stay within the confines of what your physical media allowed you to do. I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So it was slow, but it's okay because you're basically in some ways trading off the speed with stability in like not having to expand memory, things like so those little things with the curiosity part of it. I'm like, okay, the mechanics is like how it actually works and so on. I think that was something that was a big motivation for me. And so I then used that to like kind of help change how I explain some of the material on some other content, which is I like web animation a lot. It's like something that's like
Cool.
it's a rabbit hole I really go into, which probably me and like maybe two other people on the planet care about at this point because AI does it all for you. But so I just do
Yeah.
that for fun now in a different way.
That's cool. Yeah, I think that makes sense, right? Like a lot of stuff we learn or teach in CS can be really dry, right? It's like very much, um, here's the next data structure you need to learn. Here's the next one. Here's the next one. But I do also, it's interesting to say, I do really value going back and like learning who built it and why, because that gives some grounding in the decisions behind it, which helps it make more sense or at least stick. There's a really lovely book, The Dream Machine, I just got, by Mitchell Waldrop, and it goes through the history of the design of the internet and a lot of the, all the personalities and decisions behind it. So I think that's a really fun one if you haven't checked it out.
Yeah, I think storytelling is a big part
Yeah.
of teaching. And I think the storytelling just helps everything just make sense more. You're like, okay, there's a reason behind it, why it's being done this way.
Yeah.
And now I owe it to, the story to figure out why I need to know this as well, because otherwise I'm going to disservice.
Yes. Yeah. Totally. It is so much storytelling, right? Like as human beings, that's what continually resonates with most of us. Yeah. But
So getting back to you, though, we're spending too much time talking about me at this point. In terms of, you mentioned that you were doing like HTML, development in middle school. I'm always curious about this because that's around the same time I got into web development as
mm,
well. Do you remember what tool you were using for writing your HTML?
gosh, I have no recollection. I don't. What were you using?
It was essentially the first version was like Notepad, what was
Yeah.
provided. And I was like, this doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
But back then, all the web browsers, Internet Explorer and Netscape, came
Yes.
with the free web editing tool that would come with. I think Netscape
Yeah.
was called Netscape Composer,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
Internet Explorer had Front Page Express. And these were the free versions of essentially, at least on the Microsoft side, paid versions you could get. And there you had like a word editor style where it was WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. You
Yeah.
write stuff down, and then you would see HTML being generated in the background. And I was like blown away by them. Like, wow,
Yes.
I can actually do this. And then Geocities existed as a thing. And so I'd
Yes.
be like, uploading like, had like what, 500 kilobytes of space. And
Yes.
I'd be throwing stuff in there. And there were all these websites had galleries of Java applets that had like weird effects and so on. I'm like, oh, let me add these things to it and to see what happens. And I had no idea what I was doing. And I'm like, oh, like, why is like, sometimes like, one of the earliest memories of it was all my files were hard coded to my HTML files were hard coded to like locations on my physical file systems. It was like
Yeah.
C colon whatever the directory on Windows used to be. So it always worked for me whenever I viewed it, but nobody else could
Yeah.
view it. And and learning those little things about like relative paths, like the fundamentals of it, because there weren't really any books or like teaching. There was no YouTube back then. It could be like, here's
No.
how you do this, right? And so much was trial and error. And I always just find it humorous to think about how a lot of us, including I'm sure yourself and all your peers in class, had to learn some of this, and also your teacher. How did your teacher of the class also learn some of this?
Yeah.
Was
Right.
that person also just learning on the fly with you, well, actually
Yeah.
probably learning more from observing what you all
Yeah.
did because you probably had just time to experiment and try things out.
Yeah. It did really feel just like trial and error, but it also, it was really fun, like you said, because you get the visualization so quickly, and like every line was in a totally different color. It was just anything you could do and make work was exciting. And looking back at the teachers, I was a little frustrated because they really didn't provide any guidance and we just figured it out. But looking back, it's like, well, of course they could. Like they were doing the best they could by just like providing an environment for us to play. Um, and it did feel different, right? Because it was such a limited environment. You didn't get the like books and tools and YouTube, but um, you also had, yeah, a very constrained environment to work in. So I feel like it was less sort of the fire hose of information that I see students now having to sort through, trying to figure things out.
Do you feel like all the access to information we have today, do you think it helps or makes it more difficult for people to get really good at something, especially in tech?
I think both, if that's not too much of a wuss out response. Like, I think if students have, because sometimes I envy them, right? If they have a specific goal they want to achieve and learn, um, and they know which resource is going to get them there, they do have much better educational tools and resources to learn that skill than we did by far. But I think what students realistically struggle with right now is, including myself, is like with 10,000 potential things to learn and countless number of resources to learn them from. What should I be learning? What's going to benefit me the most? And which of these resources should I use? So I think students, it's kind of a paradox. Well, they have better tools to learn. They don't know what they should be learning, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think it's going back to the web example from our earlier days when we learned about it,
Yeah.
because there wasn't a lot of things you could learn from like that could get you jump started across like multiple stages of web development. You kind of took it sequentially by
Mhm.
accident. You had to
Yes.
learn the basic HTML tags, and you're like, oh, I see some text here. That looks kind of cool. How
Yeah.
to make the text look a little different? Oh, let
Right.
me learn about, at least maybe CSS wasn't even a thing. You had like maybe few colors you could specify. So it
Yeah.
was like inline styling. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to put like text color equals some number. What is this number? Is it a hex? What's a hex code
What
even
the?
mean?
Yeah.
And there's probably some website that only exists for one purpose. It was just probably a gray background, Times New Roman font, and a table where the borders were actually still visible that had like, here's red, here's a hex color. And you're
Yeah.
like, oh, let me copy and paste it in. So
Yeah.
you sort of like accidentally learned, by jumping across all these things, how to do stuff. And then eventually you hope that at some point you kind of backtrack and you're like, oh, I can see how this all ties in. But even if you didn't, at least the mechanics of what it was figured out. Whereas at least my view is that today with all the resources, you never spend enough time noodling or struggling over the most basic problems.
Yeah.
And that kind of might lead you to not have an appreciation of why some of these things work the way they do.
Oh my gosh, yes. And that is, I think, like since the chatbot explosion over the last couple of years, that's been a real challenge pedagogically to think about what is most useful for students, right? So there's been at the beginning this real panic of um, is a chatbot the new Wikipedia, the new calculator? Do we just allow students to jump ahead, not learn the basics, and use the tools available to them? And I think there was discussion and educators who felt that was the only real way, including um, English and literature folks, which I was like, hold back.
Ooh.
And then also the discussion of like the basics matter. Like you got to teach them. Students aren't going to understand what they're working with. And I think that the shakedown is starting to come where most folks are aligned with the students must learn the fundamentals because otherwise, how the heck can you audit an AI for correctness or security or maintainability or efficiency or debug it if you don't understand the underlying concepts? But that by the time they graduate, we need to introduce them to some AI tools that can help them speed up their process. So that's not to say that everyone's in alignment in that, but that's where I've seen most of the conversation go. And I agree, at least I agree with that. Yeah.
No, I think just before we started recording, we're talking a little bit about critical thinking skills and
Hmm.
how important it is for being able to do that. And at least some of the things I read is like one of the best ways to gain critical thinking skills is to make mistakes, learn from it, and just kind of like figure out like how do you actually structure a question into a series of sub questions and then figure out how to answer it. And going back to again us learning about computers and programming back in the day, there was no plan B. You had to struggle through it. You had to figure it out. And if no one had it on Yahoo or Lycos or Excite or whatever search engines that were, before Google was around, you had to kind of just trial and error it and then figure it out. And you eventually retained it because you spent so much time trying to figure out all these things that didn't work. That one thing that did work, you're like, now I get it, and why it's happening. Today, everyone has a plan B just like 5 seconds away from like the first time to hit a problem, which is I'm going to copy and paste the whole thing into a chatbot and it's going to give me an answer that's 90%, 99%, maybe depending on the question, accurate. It also explains to me what happens. And so I'm now not actually exploring this on my own. I'm just reading it from the screen and using that as a way of hopefully memorizing it, but not truly having experienced the struggle of learning it.
Yeah, it's the illusion of having done something too, right? And I've seen this in students like My class, the intro class, the massive CS0 Python course I teach is actually culture and coding, so it counts as an arts and humanities at my institution, so it fulfills a general ed requirement. But any of those courses, 25% of the grade has to come from writing. And so actually that's where I first saw most of the cheating happening, was just these AI slop essays that came in. And when I talked to students last fall, I had 35 students that, I talked back to back with, and most of them said, one, they understood they weren't getting anything from it. Like most of them realized that the essay was not theirs. Um, but two, they kept saying it's too easy, right? Like just like you said, in a moment of panic, you think turning something in is better than not. And cheating used to be a lot harder. But I think most students recognize that they're not getting anything from it. And MIT did a study on this essay writing, or was it essay writing? I think it might have been coding. I think it was coding in Fortran. So it was a language that none of the students had been exposed to, and one of the groups got to use a chatbot. One got to use just searching with Google. And the students who used the chatbot, like you said, they finished much faster. So you had that speed piece, the efficiency. But then when both groups were quizzed about the concepts or asked to explain their code, the chatbot students couldn't. They had no retention, no understanding of what they'd created, and the students who had to use only a search engine had learned, right? And I think that's intuitive, but and it's hard now, right? Because the chatbot rollout has been so fast that it's been hard to get real research done. All the research is pretty short, but it is lining up with that intuition that you just said, that like that trade-off of speed is not resulting in cognitive development.
Yeah, the example I often use is kind of like you're going to the gym, and it's not easy to be able to do, like, let's just pick an example. Like let's say, like, 10 push-ups. If you've never done a push-up before, it's not easy to be able to do that. But as you go through the struggle of doing this over a period of time, you realize, like, okay, I can do the 10 push-ups, and in doing so, I learned about posture. I got stronger. Like I got other benefits physically from being able to do this.
Yeah.
What AI in some ways gives is, like, you touch a machine to both your arms, and then you still get the output of having done 10 push-ups, but the other benefits of, like, how you get from point A to point B, you don't get those benefits anymore. So it's not that you are stronger and being able to, like, be more resilient to injury because you have upper body strength and so on. You clearly got 10 push-ups done. The check mark was there, but how the check mark got there and the benefits you got from it, you completely lost. And so I look at AI in some ways, especially for people learning the fundamentals, in much the same way. There's a certain point, the pain of needing to struggle, make mistakes, and learn, you don't want to do it anymore. You're like, I'm just going to use AI. You
Yeah.
got the output, but how you got there now created more long-term debt in some ways, where you're going to keep compounding the lack of knowledge into things that will make it very difficult for you to be successful.
Totally. I think and I actually think students know that. Um, and so it's difficult. Like I start class at the beginning of the semester saying basically the same thing. I say, like, um, using AI to do your coding is like driving a mile and calling it exercise, right? You're not getting it. But I do think students understand that. I think what is on us as educators now is to, one, help students understand the value of the exercise, right? Like, it's one thing to tell them that it's valuable, but they have to believe it. And then two, I do think there is a requirement for educators to make cheating harder. Um, and because right now, if the incentive structure is a 4.0, we're really setting up a perverse incentive for cheating if it's so easy, right? And then students who are honestly learning um, are going to have lower GPAs. So
Yeah.
as there is a pushback against educators over policing AI, which I think is a valid critique, but I think it's also really important for us to build that academic integrity and into part of the system. So, um, long-winded way of saying, yeah, AI is a tricky bugger.
Yeah, and let's flip it around. Let's say like, we have unfettered access to AI,
Mm,
and there's no reason for you to ever have to learn the fundamentals. And the example I could, come back is when I was in learning computer science, I never learned assembly or machine code or any of those
yeah,
things. It was offered as an elective when I was doing computer science at
yeah,
MIT. And the logic behind why you want to learn that was modern languages, they compile, they do memory management on their own.
yeah.
But if you don't really know how that is being done, they could make mistakes and you could write code could be
Mm,
suboptimal. And so knowing more about how all of these things work, how pointers work and so on is a critical part of it. The parallel today is similar to what you mentioned a
yeah,
few moments ago, is that the reason you want to learn about the fundamentals is that AI could be hallucinating. They could make mistakes. It could, do things in an insecure way, put your password in plain text. It could, if you're using some cloud provider, it could make some suboptimal code that causes you, spend about $5 for serving a very simple request
yeah.
without knowing the intricacies of what the code is doing. You will not be able to use AI to its full potential. And what we saw, of course, is over a period of time, the compilers and all the modern languages, they got good enough to the point where it was almost indistinguishable between what a person would have written manually in, let's say, machine code or assembly to what the compiler would have created. Do you see a world where as LLMs and AI gets more capable, more powerful, the concerns that we have today will probably vanish?
I think it's possible, and that's what's kind of difficult, right? Because one thing that I'm concerned about right now is as society, as educators, as students, have jumped on the LLM bagwagon so quickly. And the reality is, it's like a very narrow percentage of the population that is running these tools, right? And if one wins out, then you have a single source of information for everything. Even with three, that's a very, very narrow um, number of tools to get all of code. And I think it makes it incredibly likely that a backdoor will be built in, just like happened with XCutil and Gia Tan, where whoever she was, like built this backdoor into um, XCutils and almost took over millions of Linux machines. And lots of people had seen that code, but it was like just one person with expertise in that area that noticed that something was a little bit off, right? And if students and our future programmers don't have that skill set, whether it's a malicious person or a malicious AI, like we will all be um, incredibly vulnerable to this narrowing of information all coming from one information stream. And I think that's so likely to happen that we have to guard against it. And so that's like one point I'd make is the danger of like all of our code coming from a single source or just a few sources. The second is like um, no matter what the future holds, like our students need to be critical thinkers and learning those basic programming concepts are little puzzles that help them learn to think. And so um, I think they can be made fun. Um, so I think they're worth keeping just to not only know the basics and build that foundation of understanding, but to build those critical thinking skills.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with you on the importance of it. So the question then becomes, of course, is that the reason many people do learn computer science and programming and so on is so they can end up working
Yeah,
in a technology sector and doing all the
yeah,
things that are going on. If we take many steps back, right? Like I like to always go back to like the reason why so much of this happens in the creative industry. And I look at programming as a creative endeavor,
yeah,
there's an input and an output. The input is there's some problem someone is having, and the output is an application that solves it for them. That's what people ultimately pay companies for. They
Yeah.
don't pay for the code; they pay for TurboTax helps, right? I have some UI. I know my taxes are automatically done.
Right.
That was built using, HTML or whatever technology said, the implementation detail. And multiply that over everything that we're like, even the software that's being used right now for making this recording. I have no idea how it's working. I have no idea how the webcam, the audio, and you're all the way in Colorado. I'm in Washington State. It's almost real time and it works really well. I'm like, yeah, I can decrease it, but it all just works amazingly. And that's why we're using this service.
Right.
How it happens, no one really knows. And what we're seeing with AI, at least what I'm seeing with AI though, is that it's shortening the time and the gap it takes to go from I have an idea and the output needs to be done very quickly.
Yeah.
And so many people, for many, almost several decades now, made a very good living focusing on the how do I make this idea a reality part. And AI has come in and kind of like just obliterated the need for both the number of people you need, how long you need it to be done.
Yeah.
Yes, the quality may be off. For all we know, this data right now is going through unnecessary data centers to get to where it's going because it might be built by AI. It's not, but if it were, it could be going all of that. But as a general consumer, I don't really care that much. I'm like, yeah, it still works pretty fine. But as someone who had written it manually, yes, I would have not made that obvious mistake as part of it. So when we look at it from that point of view and people's general tolerance for the kind of flaws that AI would generate, I do wonder how much of like the fundamentals might help versus actually hurt in meeting the needs of the industry in some ways.
That's an interesting question. Like, I do think a lot a lot more people um, will be able to build things faster. At least that's the dream, right? That like these tools will lower some of those specialist bars so that more people can come up with an idea and try it out and get it out the door. Um, and that's exciting in a lot of ways. And then on the flip side, like you said, it can wipe out tons of specialist roles that people have, banked their education and their lives on having those jobs. Will will it hurt for students to know the basics that are computer science students? I'm not convinced of that. Um, because I think it's still helping students. Like, I don't think students who go straight into vibe coding can get that far in building something without understanding how to debug it. I think that could change, right? Like, these systems are getting better at an alarming pace. So what they'll be able to do in the next few years is anyone's guess. But I don't see learning the fundamentals hurting. Can you go into that more? What makes you think they might hurt students?
I think it goes back into, for example, a lot of programmers today do not learn machine code or assembly, and they're
Yeah,
able to be very productive
yeah,
in what they're able to do.
yeah,
And at some point, as the abstraction layers keep getting higher and higher,
yeah,
and the quality of the higher abstractions are almost indistinguishable from someone who knows the top of the abstraction layer to all the way at the bottom of the abstraction layer, what was the value gained by a person learning all of the in-between stages? Because
yeah,
I agree. You need to be able to break a problem down into its sub problems and be able to make things work. But I'm speaking from more of a historical sunken cost view where I had to learn all of that the hard way. And
yeah,
I'm like, oh, I can see what's breaking down and so on. So if let's take an example. Let's say I want to build a calculator app, for example, right? If I do it back in the, before a world of AI, I had to figure out like, okay, what are the basic operators? What is the
yeah,
scope of it? Like, do I do like more complicated expressions or just so like simple addition and subtraction and, start with there and then go beyond it. So all this thinking I'm doing on like breaking this problem down, it's an important skill I needed for a world where that was probably the best way to go from point A to point
yeah,
B. Now I can just go to ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude and just go and say, build me a calculator app. And it's going to be like, yes. And it's going to be asking me questions, not on the fundamental.
mm,
It's going to be like, is it scientific? Is it basic arithmetic and so on? I'm like, yeah, make it a scientific one. And 10, 15 seconds later, it's going to create a calculator that does all these things. I have no idea how any of it. I don't even know what programming language. That's probably because I never specified it.
Yeah.
And at that point, did I benefit from having had the knowledge in the past of all these logical, sub pieces, or am I just like equally productive and just saying like, okay, the calculator works, I ship it, people like it, and
Yeah.
I'm better off for it. I spent like 10 minutes on it, and me having done it manually, same as out. I'm also better off for it because I shipped it and I maybe learned some things from it. But was the economic value there in me having used what I learned as opposed to getting the same output in a much easier way?
Yeah. I think that that's a good question, right? Because like one of our goals as educators should be as ensuring as best we can that what we're structuring and sort of coordinating for their students' education is helping them get a job, and to be effective at that job. I don't think that they're going to be all that useful if they just build a calculator using a prompt, because essentially at that point they can be replaced by anything. And
Exactly.
and actually, your calculator comment made me actually think of something that I've heard as an argument against kind of these foundational concepts is that a calculator, like a standard TI-89, whatever, calculator is to math education as a chatbot is to computer science. So we should just allow students to go straight to the chatbot. It's just, a new wave of education. If we allow students to use calculators to do math, to move forward and progress in concepts, we should do the same for chatbots. But I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what a chatbot is, because in a calculator, 2 plus 2 is always going to be 2, right? The calculator is not going to hallucinate. The calculator itself is very unlikely to be manipulated by a malicious actor or to go rogue on you and try to manipulate you. Like, your calculator is consistent. Should be. Whereas your chatbot, if you are relying it in the same way and you don't learn those skepticism skills, you don't learn the tools to really check in detail what it's doing, you leave yourself and society and everyone prone to, our greatest potential fears of, losing humanity to a rogue AI, which I think it sounds insane, but it's so possible. It's like, so many smart minds are just laying out like how likely it is for a rogue AI to kill us all. So I think that maybe there could be a case made that like individual students might benefit for the first year or two after graduation from just learning prompt engineering. But I don't think it'll serve them long term. I think it'll make them very replaceable. And I think it also leaves all of us open to huge risk.
That's very fair because, 2 plus 2 is always 4 in a
Yeah,
calculator. Whereas we've seen many examples where you ask basic logic questions that are obvious, like count the number of R's in strawberry or
right.
things like that, where
Classic.
the AI just doesn't do a good job because it's pattern matching based on what its training data is, as opposed to truly like looking at the question and breaking it down into its sub problems.
Right.
So that is absolutely true.
Yeah. I think it is a different beast one we haven't dealt with before, so I think we have to approach it differently, you
Yeah.
know.
I think also the pace at which AI is evolving and moving makes it very difficult as well because
Oh
we always
yeah.
learn about creative destruction. We always are like, yep, people aren't exactly, the number of blacksmiths in existence today is much smaller than what it was, let's say, 100 years ago or so before, people went from, or, like from horseshoes and things like, yeah, it's blacksmith. Whoever the horseshoe people were, not the blacksmiths, I think, or blacksmiths, the people who made the horseshoes.
I think so, because yeah.
I think so, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I'm like, yeah. I'm already losing my critical thinking abilities at this point. From all the AI I use. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, so definitely less of that. But what they were able to evolve into is more of machinery in general purpose for being able to, like, build automobiles, airplanes, and some of the
Right.
skills we're able to transfer over. I think what we're seeing though is the speed at which AI is moving is that we haven't quite figured out where is the rough edges going to hit, where the boundaries of where AI ends requires us to now relearn critical thinking skills as well. And so, the example I often like to think about is we're kind of like filling this dam with water. And right, usually it's like, okay, we've hit the boundaries of where the container of the structure is, and now water is rising to the top. So you know exactly like where the rough edges are. With AI, we have yet to figure out where the constraints of the boundary actually
Yeah.
is. So we're both like planning for like what the future is going to be without knowing where is AI going to hit a roadblock and be like, okay, at this point, AI just cannot get beyond it. And then we're like, okay, you know what? For all these fundamental things, we're going to rely on AI. But the differentiating part, the critical thinking part, is now we're now going to build beyond what AI is capable of doing. I think right now, my observation is almost that we haven't figured out where the constraints of AI is yet, and so but the world doesn't stop for wait for us to figure that out. So in real time, we're trying to figure out like how can we add value, and right now the only value you can add is by regurgitating where AI is currently and trying to add the critical thinking pieces to it. Even though we know that probably a year from now, the things that we think is what we can do is going to change. And the classic example, of course, is like video generation. I look at like the classic Will Smith eating a spaghetti video
Yes.
from like 2 years ago
Yeah.
to now where you see like realistic physics effects and like water. These are things that
Crazy.
even a professional videographer with like, with years of experience will have to like make multiple takes to figure out how to get done. And so it's because in an area I'm not familiar with, I'm able to appreciate what AI is doing. A professional might be like, actually, you know what? This is actually done poorly. The lighting is off here and so on.
Yeah.
But as a simple consumer of it, I'm like, this is amazing. And
Yeah.
I think that is multiplied now across so many domains.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean it is. It is accelerating at both an exciting and an alarming pace, but I do agree that the massive shift makes anticipating, especially in education, anticipating what students are going to need, challenging. But I think that's true, like you said, across the board. It's especially for policymakers, right? Anticipating how it's going to change and what sort of policies we need to have in place is, I don't envy folks attempting to do that right now. But yeah, I remember thinking when ChatGPT launched and then I showed up in my classroom like a couple months later, it felt a little bit like, I keep coming back to future shock, but like, um, you know, most technology we hear warned about or we're alerted to decades in advance, right? Like the internet or self-driving cars have been promised for ages, right? But then it was like, um, here's ChatGPT and it's in your classroom. So I think responding to it and even students understanding how to use it and respond to it has been um, like a pretty schizophrenic experience.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't think we're going to be able to keep up with it in the way we traditionally have.
Yeah.
Um, which is why, again, I keep coming back to we need to teach students the critical thinking. And we need to create assignments that require understanding, not just code generation. Um, we need to teach students to kind of solve the problem that's right in front of them, but also be aware that how they're going to, solve that in the future might change. Um, and just to be super skeptical of the tools that they're using because
Yeah.
they're going to keep changing. And it's amazing to watch, right? Like even in what was it, a couple months ago when the thinking, Claude started showing its, I think all of them started showing their thinking as well.
Yeah.
And the output is just astronomically better every couple of months. We can't anticipate what that like barrier is, right? You'd have to have a crystal ball to pretend you could.
Yeah. You mentioned actually very interesting that I've been kind of struggling with is How do you create an assignment that actually encourages critical thinking as opposed to just putting it into ChatGPT and getting a copy and pastable answer? Can you give me an example of something that you've done that resonated with the students?
Um, well, we keep changing things. So when I first saw just the AI swap in essays, we changed our essay process to require Google Docs and require them sharing their timestamps, so that we could go line by line and ask students to show their work just like they would in a math problem. Again, to make cheating harder, it was incredibly time intensive, right? Like going through hundreds and hundreds of stamps and trying to, as like my entire UTA team, trying to learn like what human patterns of writing look like versus how it looks when students either copy paste sections or just transcribe, and just picking up on that. I mean, it was insanely time consuming. So then we moved to, and this again is just making cheating harder, right? This is making cheating harder. Then we've eventually moved through several iterations to now where we do in-class essays every couple of weeks, with this lockdown browser on their laptops that are IP constrained to the classroom. And for that week leading up, we have discussions around the topic at their table so that they're talking about the topic. They don't know exactly what it's going to be, but and then lead into it, and then they actually have to do their writing in the classroom. And even then, the first time we did this, we have paper backups for students whose computer isn't working or whatever. A student asked for the paper backup, and then we caught them inputting the essay question into ChatGPT so that they could see the ChatGPT output before they started writing. And I asked the student, I was like, okay, so you didn't even feel comfortable, like, even starting an essay before you could, like, see what a chatbot's response would be. How long have you been relying on, a chatbot to do your writing? And it was like 6 months. They'd only been using an LLM for 6 months, but they'd already gotten to the point where they were too anxious to even think about starting writing without trying to sneak in a chatbot in this super constrained environment. So it's a long way of saying, like, that's one way we're making cheating harder, is because I do really care about student thinking and writing and developing their own voice. We've created live coding challenges. So part of their exam is 3 times in the semester they have to come into the lab and do basically a technical interview test, and code right in front of a UTA. So building in, active stopping points where being able to code in real time is a requirement. And what I'm hoping to move towards is more projects, which has been very hard to scale in these massive introductory classes that are often 1,000 students. But this is where, ironically, I'm hoping to leverage AI to facilitate that. And there's people doing super cool things. Barbara Erickson at University of Michigan. Have you heard of Parsons problems?
No, I have not.
They're super cool. I mean, basically what you're doing is you give students some jumbled code so that you're removing that cognitive load of just the syntax, and they're just focused on the logic, like reordering it to get it to work. So we do this in the classroom all the time. The classic challenge is, right, like for some of these students, it's still too easy. For some of the students, it's still too hard. So Barbara Erickson has built these Parsons problems that are that leverage AI, where when a student is coding and they have some mental model that's wrong, they're missing something conceptually, the AI figures out what they don't understand, and then it designs a Parsons problem particularly to target that student's misunderstanding so that they have their own little logic puzzle to fill out, to figure out, that applies to their personalized misunderstanding. So I think I'd love to try and figure out how to do what she's doing. And then there's some other folks' work that I want to steal from. Georgia Tech is building out this LLM Socratic Mind. It's called Socratic Mind, but it's to do oral exams using an LLM, which for me is brilliant because it I think oral exams are one of the best ways
Yeah.
to get understanding. But again, in these massive classes, it hasn't been scalable. So if we can then leverage this tool that also potentially we're worried about stealing and undercutting everything we're trying to teach, but we can also maybe paradoxically leverage it to scale some of these better pedagogical techniques like oral exams, which is what they're trying to do. I think it's at Georgia Tech. So
Yeah,
yeah,
one of the things that, the oral exam one is interesting because I've heard people saying similar, that this is a great way of being able to help see how much a person learns and understands it,
good, yeah,
by talking in real time. Because at that point, until like maybe Neuralink or something else comes in that's like
yeah,
a part of us that then automatically again gets at the AI problem back again, we
yeah,
have a limited window where
yeah,
this is going to work really well. And what some people have done is actually a lot of the chatbots themselves have an audio recording mode, and so teachers have been able to tell their students to actually go and, in the lab setting, record yourself speaking to the chatbot
yeah,
itself. The chatbot comes back with an assessment of like what you did correctly or not do correctly. And some of these chatbots have been more custom trained and fine tuned, and what the school thinks is like an appropriate answer versus just like
yeah,
normal, out of the off the shelf ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude. And that has shown a reasonable way of scaling and
yeah,
also being able to help reduce the reliance on other methods that are, as we're finding out, are easily gameable.
yeah,
One of the classic problems you're mentioning about people cheating on assignments, it applies to interviews as well, where we see so many cases where people are using all these tools that are getting increasingly more sophisticated to
yeah,
bypass whatever filters that all the companies provide in terms of how to, detect people doing weird AI related answers as opposed to thinking on their own. And all of them is like a losing battle because it's kind of like classic security in some ways, is that whoever the hackers will always find a way to bypass
yeah,
whatever the best security researchers have found. So it's always a cat and mouse game that never quite ends.
yeah,
And the solution right now that a lot of companies are thinking about is maybe we bring back in-person interviews, where we bring the person to the place to interview in real time in front of a human being, as opposed to doing it over a computer, which in all ways it almost seems like the solution so far is, let's get back to something that isn't a screen that AI currently operates in. When AI gets outside of the screen through a robot or through an implant of some sort,
yeah.
then, again, probably heard of something new, but it's always amusing to hear that is we're going back to what we all discarded many years ago as like, yeah, it's so inefficient. Let's go back. Let's not do that anymore.
You don't need to fly everyone out. Yeah, and it's the same. It's so interesting to see how the same thing's reflected in education, right? Like we're we're saying kind of the same thing. Like you now need to code in front of us, and a real move. Like when I inherited the class, all the exams were online. Ain't no way. Everything's in person and paper now, and I think that's important. Like I have a friend's son who graduated last year from CSU, not in the CS department, and I was like, "How did your finals go?" And he was like, "ChatGPT." I was like, "What do you mean?" He was like, "They're all online at home," and I just thought, "Oh my gosh, what is the point?" So yeah, I think there's some folks who have figured out some creative, like really thoughtful ways to do online exams that are still testing for understanding. But I haven't figured out how to do that with CS0 stuff. So it's in person. Yeah.
Yeah. No, so what do you think the future of education is going to be, especially computer education? Like, let's assume there's going to be a world where AI becomes much more powerful and
Mm,
capable. So a lot of the gaps that one might detect with AI are no longer going to be there. And let's also anticipate there's going to be a world where, just like pacemakers, so many decades ago, that we're all going to be more and more comfortable having, some kind of like Black Mirror episode style, like, something attached just to the side of your forehead, or a watch or a ring that essentially enhances your thinking ability by combining your own brain waves with computer assisted kind of capabilities. What do you see in that world, and what do we all do as people who like to teach the next generation to use technology?
yeah, that's a freaky Black Mirror idea. I have already thought, like, I think in the limited short term, about the Meta Ray-Ban glasses. So I have like walked around and made sure in exams that folks aren't wearing them, but I don't think they're quite at the point that they will be soon, where they'll probably just be able to wear them, look at the exam, see the answers reflected. So I think we're pretty close to that, uh, the smart glasses version. But I'm, gonna have to come up with a policy of no smart glasses during exams. What it looks like in education when everyone has basically an AI companion, what you're saying, an AI companion kind of like connected to them, like part of their brain even.
Yeah, if you go all sci-fi, it's like the classic singularity where the human and AI merge, where we're probably the last generation of humans that are more biological than probably some combination of, cyborg style thing, which I don't think is that far-fetched in many ways.
No,
We are
it's
seeing
not.
great progress where people have lost the ability to use limbs and various,
Yeah.
things from like neurological issues are able to now gain function back. And once we get that, not perfected, but to a state where, what, now we can actually go beyond and actually help regular, situations be more enhanced. And a classic example I like to give is like, I got LASIK done a
Yeah.
few years.
Yeah.
And that to me was one of those like life changing experiences where I'm like, I did not believe that, I don't have to deal with contacts anymore. I have like 2010 vision right now. And I was like,
Sweet.
wow, like imagine like that's not even like, anything beyond just like adjusting things already there. But what if it's a nanobot that now like, basically is like able to go between various parts of my body and just fixes things like
Hmm.
Elysium, like the sci-fi movies where you just like go through a little window or a door, you're magically healed of everything. There is a world where that could maybe happen.
Yeah. There's things about that that I like, right? I love the idea of folks being able to be healed of, really challenging medical conditions. But what I don't like is the idea of, you're kind of talking about prosthetics, a prosthetic for your brain, and having to teach to that. Like for me right now, my first instinct is I will retire. If I am teaching a classroom of students who are AIs, like that's so unsettling to me. And I don't think you're wrong that it's um, very possible. I'm just not ready to think what that would look like in education. What would you do? This is the classic teacher move. What would you do?
I don't know because I look at it like in multiple ways.
Yeah,
One is that personally, I wouldn't want to be in a world where I am, being my basic thoughts and activities are governed by another device or AI that's going to be doing this. That's like stage zero of where I think about. And then I look at it and go, we're in a world where everyone is competitive. And if there's something that's going to give you an edge in being able to accomplish a task
yeah,
more effectively, faster, cheaper, and things like that, you're not competing with people who don't have the same concerns
yeah.
that I have. And so they'll gladly be able to do this. Because I enjoy
That's
working
smart.
in the tech industry, I'm almost certain at some point companies are going to go, we would rather work with people who are okay with like working faster, with less
Yeah,
time to get things done. They don't get fatigued as easily and so on. And I'm going to go ahead and, go with those people. At
yeah,
which point now I have an economic incentive to now subscribe to this particular model. Now let's go broader beyond just, myself here. Countries and societies, they compete with each other for resources and for relevance and
yeah,
prestige and so on. It's going to be odd when, we're in America, when other countries are now leaping ahead with basically having their entire populations now being AI enhanced, where they're now able to do
yeah,
all these things, and when we're not, in which case we get far less competitive, which means more industries do not come here, which, society benefits when, economically you're doing better. And if economic value is now going to go to those countries who do not have the hesitancy when it comes to AI, there's some
yeah.
other policy-wise it
Right.
changes, which then downstream impacts what people learn in education and so on. So is it a losing battle for me to resist this kind of change, or are we going to create this kind of a world where you have like multiple factions in society? So you have one group that is all about like, I love video games like Mass Effect. It's one of my favorite games of all time. Do you create a world where you have like basically a society of cyborgs who, have great abilities and also, of course, their own flaws. They need power source and things like that. And then you have a group of like pure humans where they're like, no, we're not going to do anything that has like AI or anything in it. Then you have the people in the middle who kind of play both sides.
Yeah.
What do you do at that point? Like, I don't think a TV show has been created that answers that question effectively, or at least it games out the scenarios. And so for me, even though I have objections, I think I will resort to having to basically gradually and then quickly adopt the latest technologies, because if I don't, I risk being made irrelevant.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. In a competitive world, it seems like the likely outcome, if like taking biohacking to the next level, being tech hacking your body is going to make you more competitive. Um, People are going to do it. Everyone's going to do it. And those that don't are going to be the new Amish, I guess. Like, we're just going
I
to,
think so. And I think it's also like, it's not completely unheard of today, where it's not exactly like robots and, AI
yeah.
enhanced things. But, I knew in college, a lot of people that I knew were studying, they definitely took like, I think like Adderall or something like that to give them an extra edge in performing. And then I also, you hear like, once they get into like the professional industry, some people continue that because they're like, what, why would not? Yeah, the side effects are not great, but I would rather take these and, get an edge in being able to do things than not. And so, you didn't take it to the next level. It's like, okay, now you have something that gives you the same level of performance without the side effects and so on. Like, what do you do in those kind of situations where
Yeah.
the mass majority of individuals are now taking things that are making them more capable of getting things done? How they get it done, of course, has evolved. But we've always seen in society, if there's a way to get an edge in getting something
Mm-hmm.
done that has economic value, people will always seek it.
Totally. Yeah, it'd be really hard not to. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, what would education look like there? Maybe just uploading stuff, uploading stuff to their brains. I think the part of me that just gets a little like icked out is still that distrust. I think I have a strong distrust of um, what could happen to humanity in that situation. So, like, did you hear about that story about Travis Kalanick, the prior CEO of Uber? Did you, like, he was using a chatbot and was absolutely convinced he was without a college degree that he was pushing the edges of quantum computing or quantum mechanics, I think. Just like this
I
self,
did not hear that.
yeah.
No.
So just like, and I think that he's not alone, right? Like it may be that CEOs are more prone to this egomaniacal effects of the sycophantic chatbots, but I think so many stories are coming out around this manipulation. And at this point, you know, the chatbots are not capable of like truly manipulating us at a mass scale, but based on what we're seeing, I think that that could happen so soon. And if we're plugged in and we really don't understand the underlying um, black boxes of these tools, we genuinely don't know um, what will happen, even if we think we do. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
think that goes back.
I don't, or even if let's say we don't end up with some AI who just wants to toy with us or use us, like we would be so prone to being hacked into. I mean, it's not just like an energy infrastructure that you could hack into like Russia did with Ukraine, like the Lazarus group or the evil group, like I mean, what's to stop them from hacking into an entire population if we do that? I find it just, yes, like you said, so Black Mirror-y. And as you pointed out, still very likely, but gives me the heebie-jeebies, Kirupa.
Yeah, no, it's going to be, one of those things where we are questioning it, we're skeptical, and we're like, this may not be the thing
Mm,
that we do. Whereas I think the next generation may be less skeptical because they
yeah,
grew up with it. For
totally.
me, whenever I think about computers and so on, I still remember like a dial-up modem and like,
Mm-hmm.
the sound it would make,
That
like the little
screech.
buzzing sound, the screech, and then, there was like this whole firmware update, because you had like back then you had like two camps, one that had like I think like the US robotics one, the other one's like something by Lucent, and then eventually converged. I think it's called like
Yeah.
V.90 or V90, and then like all your modems now could communicate with all the ISPs now. Before you had like choose your ISP based on your modem type and so on,
Yep.
and so that's the history that like we come from in some ways of like technology and what it was cutting edge. Whereas, for example, my daughter, she's so
Yeah.
natural with like an iPad and like knows
Yeah.
exactly like touch and how to make all these things work and so on. Where I'd say I'm more productive with a keyboard and mouse. Even
Mm-hmm.
now, that I
Mm-hmm.
have touch devices, I'm like, I'd rather use a keyboard and mouse. Whereas in her case, it's like, no, this all is how I'm going to do it. And if any issue comes up, she knows exactly like where to drag the gesture and all these things. Whereas I'm like, wow, I would not have thought to like swipe from that direction, which is funny because I spend a lot of time using devices and I like to think of myself as like more on the cutting edge of learning and exploring all these things. I'm already behind. And another example of it is self-driving vehicles. The
Yeah.
question is like, would I ever truly trust a self-driving vehicle? Would I ever be trusting enough to fall asleep in one while it's taking me from point A to point B? I probably may not, may never.
Mm.
Certain, my daughter's like 7. She's not going to learn to drive until, probably like, I think like legally until like 9, 10 years from now. 10 years from now, maybe all vehicles by default will be self-driving, at which point it's like, why would I need to learn to drive? And if you're so accustomed to all you ever seen is a self-driving vehicle,
Yeah.
you don't have a concept of what it's not like to have a button that is pressed, there's no steering wheel, you're like, of course I'm gonna fall asleep. Like, why would you not? Whereas I'm gonna be like constantly on the lookout of going like, I read this one story in 1995 or like 2005, 2015 of, this car didn't do right when it was self-driving. And that would be like in 2035, I'm like, yeah, you remember 30 years ago? It didn't work out well. So I'm going to keep looking out for this. Like, I'm going to be one of those people that I often like to look at and be like, get with the times, and I'm going to be that person where other people are going to be like, that guy needs to get with the times.
Yeah. Hey, old man. That's so funny because for me, self-driving cars, I'm already like, give them to me. I-25 here is just like a death trap, and I'm like, I would much rather be surrounded by robots driving, than whoever these yahoos are. But in hearing you talk, I just get even more like convinced that skepticism has to be one of the main things we're teaching students across all disciplines, right? Um, to like think about the training data potentially that was used, to be skeptical of the information that an AI is giving them, to be aware of who owns that particular model, and what their motivations might be. Yeah, this conversation is just making me feel more entrenched that our young people need to be taught to be incredibly skeptical of these tools.
And a thought process that needs to help you be skeptical in a constructive way is just useful in general for life as well. Like I
Yeah.
always joke around about, I took AP history, not because I became a historian, but it was like you get the college credit and all of that.
Yeah.
And a big part of that, of course, is like, not just about knowing various facts, but also like reading these source documents and then like kind of summarizing
Mm.
them and putting a document together. Not that I'm ever going to use the actual skills of like summarizing stamps and handwritten messages from like the 1700s, something useful, but the underlying skills of being able to connect the dots between various things in the context that we're trying to solve, I think it's a hugely valuable skill, especially in like real-time communication where you're in a conversation with somebody and someone says something and you're trying to like quickly understand what they're trying to do and how it ties in what we're trying to do here. Those are all skills that, to go back to the point, until we get AI implants that kind of solve it for us, we need to figure this out on our own.
Yeah.
And I agree. The more critical thinking you have, there's also the case to be made that you'll be able to use AI more effectively as well. Because prompt engineering is something people talk about. I'm not convinced it's a thing. I think prompt engineering is just something that's a moment in time problem.
I
But
think
over a
so.
period of time, AI will figure out like what you mean. And if it takes like 5 seconds for you to be like, oh, I didn't mean that, I want to do this instead, that's it. That's prompt engineering. Like the
Yeah.
goal of like getting in one shot, I don't think it's a long-term goal that we should be striving for. But that's a different topic of again,
Oh,
old
I
man, young
agree
at
with
cloud.
you. Yeah.
That's me with like, prompt engineering, I think.
Yeah.
But I do think the critical skills are actually going to help you use AI more effectively, whatever shape AI ends up taking. When
Yeah.
AI does hit the boundaries of what's possible, until then, all the things you learned will then help you then make the leap beyond what AI can do.
I couldn't agree more. And I mean, I think like we don't know. We don't know what AI is going to look like 6 months from now, much less 4 years from now, um, when students, my current, freshman students are graduating. But what does distinguish them from the AI is that they are humans and they have a human mind. And I don't think we do them any favors by teaching them cognitive offloading, right? The one thing that we can give them is the ability to think critically and to learn critical thinking skills and to learn so that, as you said, no matter where AI is, like whatever that boundary is throughout their lives, they have something that differentiates them from folks who can only use the AI without any thought process, right? So um, it is a shifting goalpost in terms of where students will be, and what AI is capable of. But I think the things that make us human or the things that stretch us cognitively, those won't change until, I mean, your dark mirror point of the implants. But I can't, that's as far, that's as far out as I can think.
Yeah, and so many research has kind of shown that stretching your brain to be more critical at thinking, and I think like being able to learn new things and be able to adapt, it just has like downstream effects on so many other parts of your life as well. I think it's got like
Mm.
neuroplasticity, like the ability for you to continuously be able to learn new things and be able to retain it and then assign it to various other things you've done. It's turned out it's like a great part of like living longer and healthier lives as well. So there's many benefits beyond just I get a job done, for the company I'm working at.
There are, and again, it comes back to that way. Like I think about, what we're saying. Like there is so much usefulness in the struggle in terms of learning, and but when speed and efficiency are so in front of you, it is still hard for us as educators to make that case, right? Like because we don't want to struggle, right? The human brain, we would prefer not to. And so trying, I think, like continually to build that useful struggle into the classroom in a way that students buy into, but also that you kind of make them do, is a critical part of education when skipping those steps is just suddenly so easy for students. So changing that incentive structure and I do think shifting how we create assignments so that we're still valuing that um, is the direction I still want to go. But
And I guess the shift topic slightly is we talked a little bit about the incentive structure.
mm,
Why are people learning things you're doing, and what makes this all work? A big incentive, I think, for a lot of definitely for me when I was into tech is like I enjoy tech, but I also know there's going to be a career for it, and I'm going to go through the struggle of learning all these ins and outs of all these various things.
right.
And one of the things we are seeing right now is the industry overall seems to not be as eager to hire fresh graduates or people with very little experience and all of that. Instead, they're opting for more senior individuals who do have that critical ability they may have learned before a world of AI, because they are seeing that there is a gap in like what it means to train someone to have the critical thinking when they didn't have it at a more foundational age, or part of their educational experience. And now we'd rather go with more experienced individuals. And one of the things I predict might happen is enrollment in computer science has always been fairly high because of the promise that it gives you a better quality of life than other disciplines you might be getting into. If that cycle where I get an education, I get a good job, if that breaks, there may be a world where people are not spending as much time learning about computer science or enrolling in computer science classes. And I see it from my own writings on technical things where fewer and fewer people are actually going to it. Part of it is distribution problem where chatbots are taking it, but in me
Yeah.
just having a conversation with people, it's also like, what's the point of me learning it? Because back then I could have learned it and made like a nice side project or career doing part-time development of things. Now there's no future for me, so there's no point in me learning this. Do you see a world where everything that we're talking about is in many ways similar to like many people would have talked about in other disciplines, like let's say blacksmithing,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
ago, or how do I make a widget for something like that before automation came in, where we're talking about the right things and it's all 100% correct, but the incentive for someone to even get into the funnel to actually learn this
Mm.
completely goes away, where it's all a moot point at the end of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. Like the promise for the last 2 decades has been get a computer science degree, you're going to have a great career. And that's changing, or at least perceived to be changing. You will, if you look at the numbers, the incoming computer science class across the United States is smaller. So it's dropped for the first time in years. So head on with your prediction. Um, and there is a real anxiety, understandably, in current computer science students about what jobs, if any, they're going to be graduating into. And I
Yeah.
feel this pressure too, right? Because as an educator, you want to ensure that you're giving students the best information possible, and that goal keeps changing. Um, and there are my students are having a harder time getting jobs right now. Part of it, I think there's two things actually going on. One, I think, is fewer um, junior engineers are getting hired, to your point, right? But I also think like money isn't cheap anymore, so the number of startups is down. So like 5 years ago, there was a startup around every corner. So I think both things are happening. But I talked to at Google I/O this last year an engineer from Airbnb, like a lead engineer, and he said they've cut their internship program because they know they're not going to hire from it, and they're not hiring junior engineers. And I was like, well, what what do I tell, what do I tell my students? How do they jump from where we have them now to the level that you're hiring at? And if we get them there, is the goalpost going to move again? Right? And he said he didn't know. I think I'm hoping that there will be um, some movement in industry to change those internships to be internships that hire at the junior level and move people to the senior level. Um, but we really don't know. We don't really know at this point. What are you seeing on your teams? Are interns, junior engineers being hired or anything like that?
Similar trends.
Yeah,
The numbers from what it used to be, far lower, and
yeah,
oftentimes they have to have differentiated themselves far beyond what their academic coursework would have dictated they'd be able to do this. So the same
yeah,
kind of things that often might have led into like getting into competitive universities and so on, where you do your course curriculum really well, then you have like extracurriculars, and then you do that above and beyond to be able to even in the running for some of these things.
yeah,
That same kind of thing is now happening, partly because it's a supply demand issue. The demand has gone down
yeah.
significantly, and the supply, is
It's been
starting to
growing. Yeah,
decrease, like you're mentioning, but there's still, a mismatch where you have a lot of people extremely qualified not being able to, get out from like an internship kind of a program. And of course, also complicated by a lot of experienced individuals who've been in the industry for a long time,
yeah,
also on the market right now,
yeah.
looking for roles. So it's definitely a very messy time in terms of it.
It is. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if, like, to a degree, there's some leveling out and a little bit of a CS bubble kind of leveling out. But I do still think, like, when you ask folks, like, I sat in like, I guess it was kind of a lecture with um, Sergey Brin and Demis Hassabis. How do you say his name?
Yeah, I think it's a Sabas.
Hassabis. Okay. And they were like, oh, yeah. I mean, computer science is still going to be a thing. You just got to, you just gotta learn to learn, and all these skills will still be important, but you're just gonna have to be able to understand the tools and get them to work together. And so you hear a lot of that too, but it does seem like it'll be an elevation of some of the same skills and perhaps fewer of those positions overall. Hard to tell for sure, but yeah, I think it is hard.
Yeah.
There's a lot of understandable anxiety for students because I even felt like in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was less of this clear career trajectory than our parents had had, like where you have a major, then you have a job, then you stay in it forever. It was like, oh, like, hey, you're gonna have 5 different careers, so your major doesn't matter. And like it was just also an uncertain time, and that uncertainty um, is so much more for current students and
Yeah.
providing them that sort of like structure to learn and go somewhere is harder, I think, to do and harder for students to navigate. So I think they're under a lot of pressure.
Oh, 100%. They're
Yeah.
in uncharted territory. There's no prior art they can
Yeah.
rely on what works and doesn't work. And the cost for messing up is extremely high, almost to the point where there may not be a second or third chance, on
Yeah.
being able to recover from it. And that kind of, before we recorded, we were talking about how a lot of students who are in the job market who, just joined are far more driven about going from point A to point B in
Because they
their
have
career
to.
and so on because they have to.
Yeah.
The luxury of like, let me become a domain expert. Let me actually, become extremely good at understanding why things are happening the way they are and so on. That is a luxury that I think, that is not very common anymore because
Yeah.
you're going to be out hustled basically by someone else who is at least able to pretend like they know all the details really well. And the output, again, you're not going to evaluate the difference with like, is the craft really high quality? As long as the output's the same, I'm going to go for the one that has provided it faster, cheaper, and, with far less of like any kind of complications. And if AI is going to help me do that,
Yeah.
if, other things are going to help me do that, I'm absolutely going to go down that path, which does make it challenging in many ways, especially if you're trying to elevate the art of software engineering. Like, how do you build successful teams? How do you build productive teams that are, provide good work-life balance, that do all the things that we used to value as like the things that we want to see in our
Yeah.
environment? You're like, that's only a matter of time before the incentives are never aligned for that. It's like, you know what? It's no longer in your best interest to focus on those things. We focus on something else now, and you have to adapt.
Gosh, that's making me think when you talk about like a serious domain expert, it seems like over the last 20 years, like becoming a niche domain expert was kind of the way to differentiate yourself and ensure that you had like an area of focus, and it was needed, right? Because CS is exploding in every direction, and like you can't be an expert in everything, much less even within one domain. So being a domain expert was a direction you could go. Um, Whereas now, the field changes so rapidly. It's like, what's the value of being a domain expert if it's going to change? I don't know. It's yeah. I Kirupa, what should I tell my students?
I don't know. I actually do not know. This is something I struggle with a lot
Yeah,
because, we talked earlier about like how I enjoy teaching and writing and so on.
yeah,
I will say my enjoyment of it in some ways has decreased quite a bit, I'd say, over the last
yeah.
year because the output, the end game doesn't make sense to me anymore because there's no point in me becoming like, understanding what developers want to do by building it myself, as opposed to like looking at what they're building, looking at the output, going to ChatGPT and being like, oh, explain to me how this particular thing works. It gives me a very detailed summary because I
Mm,
already have the prior knowledge of many of the foundational pieces. Those one or two minor connections that are new for me, I'm like, okay, I don't have to build something myself to understand that. I exactly see how it goes, and it stays in my long-term memory as well. I'm like, that makes sense now. I get exactly where that's going. And of course, because of AI and ChatGPT and so on, no one really is consuming that more foundational knowledge anymore as well like they used to. And so I'm also like, am I just shouting to the void right now? I
mm,
enjoy the part of it, and I'm going to do that. And so the question I would ask myself is like, do I enjoy teaching, or do I enjoy teaching computer topics more? Like, where do I have to scale back a bit to more of a foundational state and then pivot? And that's actually a question I would have for you as well, because you have pivoted, from working in tech and startups to to teaching. Would you still enjoy teaching if you were no longer teaching a computer related topic? Or is it the combination of you enjoy teaching, you also enjoy teaching computer science and computer adjacent topics?
that's a good question. I think I really love teaching computer adjacent topics. So I think it'd be hard for me to pivot. Well, I do teach a CS ethics course that I love, but it's still very much adjacent. So, yeah, I don't know what that would look like, but I do want to better understand what you were saying when you said that you were you were you're enjoying teaching less. And is it because you're seeing less people use it because they're using chatbots to get the same information, or you're seeing less of a need for what you're producing and it feels less meaningful?
I think it's a little bit of both, but I think the
Yeah.
bigger one is like I guess an example of it is there used to be value in like teaching people how to harvest the wood and make the paper, and then you write on the piece of paper. With AI and the simplification and the abstraction that
Mm,
came through it, it's like what is the value add I'm providing? Because one of the reasons I do want to teach is that it benefits somebody. Someone's going to spend 10 minutes reading or watching a video of mine. There should be something they get out of it that they couldn't have gotten in a meaningful way using alternate better methods. Now I could be entirely be like, you know what, the stuff I provide is conventional humorous and things like that. They'll absolutely want to do this. But a part of me is also like there should be something they get out of it that helps
yeah,
them in their life in some meaningful way.
yeah,
I'm finding it difficult to make that connection where what I'm actually teaching is going to have any meaningful input on what they're doing. Like a lot of my audience right now is just people who've known me for decades at this point. So I'm like, yeah, these are people who've been just like, accustomed to reading and seeing things that I'm doing. But that's not my goal of doing this, though. I actually want to help teach something meaningful for people who do not know about this in the current environment.
yeah.
And that's the part where I think AI is actually doing a pretty decent job of closing the loop on I don't know something, I'm going to get the answer very quickly. And that is enough because that then helps me basically be more successful at the assignment I'm doing, the job I'm doing. Long term, I think you and I talked about it before. I think that might have its own implications where you might not be thinking about the subtle details, the edge cases, and so on. That's going to be critical for you to understand, independent of the critical thinking and all those other pieces. But that's something where I don't know what the outcome's going to be like in the future.
Yeah, so I think like the role of educator as curator in some ways becomes even more important now. Like I think that's always been a role of an educator, right? Is like here's the information we're going to learn, here's the structure, and helping students kind of stay focused on that. And I think while students, humans, all of us can learn a lot, right, from these new tools. I do it all the time. I'm like, asking all kinds of things. Like I have these 7 ingredients I'm trying to use up. Tell me what I can make with it. Um, well, 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 we can learn a lot from them. Um, what is it that students will be learning, right? And so that's where I think now it's even more valuable for the educator to be the curator. And I think this has been true for a little while. I think like the 60 Coursera courses that I've started and never finished are like a great example of this, right? Like having a structure and an end goal and a curated environment, I think is important. And it reminds me of this talk Derek Mueller did a couple, maybe like 6 months ago. Do you know Derek Mueller from Veritasium?
Oh yes, 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 yes.
Love him. Super fan, right? What a beautiful way to communicate in an educational and creative and joyful way. He's a real talent. But he was doing a talk at a technical university in Canada, and someone asked him kind of like, is AI going to fundamentally make current educational systems defunct? Something like that. I'm going to get it wrong, but he was like, no, like in the 90s, the internet was going to destroy the teaching role. In the 2000s, it was Wikipedia, and then it was MOOCs, these massive open online courses, and Khan Academy, all of which are, I mean, Khan Academy is amazing. And massive open online courses rolled out, right? You could take the best courses in the world for free, but did that destroy education? No, right? So I think kind of what he was saying is like this is another new tool, but it's not going to destroy kind of this educational process. And the reason I agree with him on that is, for the reasons I've just said, there's so much information. How do you decide what to learn in a structured way? And so in many ways, I think that moves the role of the educator um, less from like focusing on the really like nitty gritty details and more on kind of providing a clear structure that's joyful and engaging and answers the why and builds in those skills, but that is something students can, especially in an increasingly uncertain world, like lean in on so that they feel a sense of direction.
I mean, that's a fantastic way of summarizing our entire conversation here. And so I think with that, thank you so much for talking to me about all of these, interesting topics, and for this really great discussion as well. Any parting words before we end this?
No, it was great to talk to you, and always enjoyable to chat with folks who care about humans and tech and education. So, yeah, I'd love to talk to you again, and hope you have a gorgeous day, sir.
And if any robot cyborgs are listening to this, we also care about robots and
Right.
cyborgs as
Yes.
well. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, we want to cover our bases here, just to be safe.
We are teaching the students who create you, so therefore I'm sort of your grandma, so don't kill me.
There you go.
All right. See ya.